Hi, I'm glad you're still here, and if you're new, please know that in these two videos I'm creating a license plate asset for DAZ Studio, and there is a part 1 dealing with all the mesh and geometry stuff in Blender. My license plate is still a white empty object, so my next step is to draw a texture. I need a text and some simple graphical elements on my license plate. As you can see here, the real plates have the coat of arms of the federal state the vehicle is registered in, and there is also a blue badge brandishing the EU circle of stars. The Germans have their own layout with a different font and an additional safety test sticker telling you that the vehicle is safe enough for the roads and when the next test is due. You see, there are differences, and I feel free to design my own system. The graphical nature of my endeavor is an indication for a vector-based editor, the likes of Affinity Designer, which I'm gonna be using. If you want to play along and don't have the Affinity software, I'm tempted to recommend Draw.io. It's free, and there is also an online version, so you wouldn't even have to install anything. Go figure. But considering what I want to create, I'm afraid Draw.io is a bit too simple and clumsy for this, so I'm gonna recommend Krita instead. Krita is free, open source, multi-platform, specialized in 2D painting and therefore well established in the cartoon manga community that also doesn't like to be ripped off by subscription-based software like the Adobe suite. Although its emphasis lies in raster operations, its vector functions are way sufficient for my task. However, I'm not inclined to learning yet another software, so I stick to my Affinity Designer in this video. To get the proportions for my 2D editing right, I need a UV template. I can create one by opening the UV menu in Blender's UV editor and select Export UV Layout. This opens a file dialog where I first set a name telling me it's the UV layout for that particular OBJ file. Finally, I set the size of the template to the size I want the texture map to be. Then I hit Export UV Layout. Similar to importing OBJs into DAZ Studio, I can simply drag and drop an image file into Affinity Designer. And for a start, I take the UV template I just created. The area where I must draw is just a faceplate. All other parts will have a different material, which I will select from my DAZ Studio shader collection. The background layer will not be in the final image, it's just for orientation, and the checkerboard pattern in my canvas tells me that everything is transparent now. So I select the rectangle tool and draw a rectangle which serves as a background. It also will define the area to export, we will see that later. I change the layer order to have the template on top. And I set the rectangle's background color to white. Now I'm ready for some text. The artistic text tool lets me write straight away. What shall I write? Let's go for MC 68,000. That's not the font I want. To change it, I gotta select my text and bring in the character panel, which gives me more control over the text than the context toolbar on top. To display that panel, I go to Window, Text, Character, and here it is. Finding the right font is one of those things you could spend ages on. I go for Rubik, well knowing that this font would never make it on a real license plate because it can be misread. On a bad photo you could mistake a C for an O or vice versa. Now I place it on the face, making sure that there is enough margin. The blank in the middle is intentional, by the way. The font settings per se don't let me freely choose the line thickness. I use the contour tool for that. The radius sets the thickness, better not too thick because I want to add an effect. But much later I found out that the contour tool can cause artifacts, but no worries, there are other ways to solve this problem. The character panel has that decorations section. There you can set the stroke. That opens up a dialog where I can set the style and width of the stroke. That appears to be the safer way to achieve a custom thickness for characters. It also feels more logical, to be honest. In the layer panel's bottom toolbar there is that tiny FX button. If I click it, Designer opens the Layers Effects dialog. There I check Outer Glow. The entry must be selected for the dialog to show the settings. and the settings need some experimentation until I get what I want. I forgot the space for the left side badge, so I squeezed the text a little bit. I'm glad having a powerful software helping me with creating the circle of stars. I start by drawing a filled circle, which I use for arranging the stars. I do that in the place where the stars will be in the end to get a feel for the size. But then I move the circle to an empty space so that no other objects are in the way. Affinity Designer offers some generic shapes, one of which is a star. After having set up the star's size, I move it to the top of the circle. Now I enable Transform Origin, which will allow me to move a selected object's origin point. And I move the star's origin to the circle's center. With Ctrl J, I duplicate the star. You can see that also in the Layers panel. With the Move tool being active, my selected object has a rotation handle, and if I press Shift while moving this handle, I can rotate the object in 15-degree step around its origin. The cool thing in Affinity Designer is that it memorizes the last move operation and repeats it for the next application. That way, it's very easy to get my 12 stars. The downside though is that each star now points to the circle's center, while the real EU stars maintain their orientation around the circle. Didn't find an easy solution for this, but it's only 12, not 50, so I do it manually. Finally, I delete the circle and group the stars. After placing them where the badge will be, I create the blue background by drawing a rectangle and carefully make sure that it doesn't stick out of my template. While drawing the rectangle, I still had orange selected as a foreground color, but nothing easier than changing that. Now the stars are in the background, but no worries, there are buttons for the Z order in the toolbar. In Europe, we have the country code beneath the circle of stars, and I go for something non-existing. And again, I set the letters custom width by wrongly using the contour tool. Now for the middle. That's where the states proudly present their coat of arms or a hint to the state's specifics. As I mentioned, I live in Austria, and that vulture is a worthy representative of our state's finances. So maybe make it red to emphasize the urgency. A high-level complaint, yeah, I know. For changing the color, I use an adjustment layer. I can add one by clicking the Adjustments button in the Layers panel. In the menu, I decide for Recolor. That opens up a dialog where I tweak the settings until I'm satisfied with the vulture's look. We notice the vulture's image has a white background, but that doesn't matter as long as my background for the license plate is white as well. See? Now what you see here is the texture which makes up the color of my license plate. Sometimes this is also referred to albedo because it defines how the surface diffusely reflects the light. DAZ Studio uses NVIDIA's iRay render engine, and funnily enough, NVIDIA even uses one of their renders as main showcase on their webpage. iRay doesn't call it albedo but base color, and to apply a map to the shader's base color I must have the object selected, be on the Surfaces tab, and have the actual surface of the object selected. Then I see the base color as one of the shader's properties. With a little arrow down button I can open a menu where I can select the image file for the map. If I do so, my license plate looks like that. That's nice, but it can be better, because the image appears flat as if it was a foil glued to the plate, while in the real world the letters are embossed in sheet metal. Of course, I could create an embossed plate in Blender, but this is very laborious and generates tons of vertices. So why would I sweat blood getting the complicated topology right if there's a much more elegant solution for this? The bump map. A bump map is a grayscale image telling the shader to fake geometry, and here I'm creating one. A bump map lets everything darker than the middle gray appear deeper than the actual geometry, a dip if you so will, and everything lighter will look raised. The shader accepts all values between black and white, so my Gaussian blur will appear as a slope. For demonstration in DAZ Studio, I create a plane and lift it slightly above the ground. While being in the array preview mode and having the plane and surface selected, I set the albedo, that's the color, slightly darker to mitigate the overexposure. There are some specks in the surface, but these are only reflections of the HDRI sky I'm using for lighting. See? And now I select the bump map image I previously exported in Affinity Designer. At first glance nothing happens, but this is only because I must dial in the amount of bump the shader applies. With a fair amount of bump, the map's pattern shows up, and the more I increase the value, the more pronounced the effect appears. Using such a shallow angle, it doesn't really look that good, but once I tilt the plane, you get the impression that there are embossings even you are technically looking on a flat plane spanned by only 4 vertices. It's still some sort of bistable perception since your brains can make it flip around, but the color map will help you with that, you'll see. To create a bump map for the license plate, I duplicate the text layer. With the duplication, the new layer also got the glow effect, which I don't need anymore. Then I make the font thicker, here still with a flawed method, but you know better in the meanwhile. And I add a Gaussian blur to the text. This will soften the edges in a way that the text's black will smoothly dissolve into the white background. It does that with the formula for normal distribution, which will eventually cause our bump map to have the normal distribution's profile. Well, you could write your diploma thesis on that, but for me it's a super easy way to get an embossing effect for my text. The vulture might be a sticker on an embossed shape, so I add a pentagon using the polygon tool. After placing it, I must change the layer order, which I can not only do with the dedicated buttons, but also by dragging the layer entry in the Layers panel. If it shall stick out like the text, its color must be black. And finally, I add the Gaussian blur to it. Don't worry about the vulture's white background, we won't see that. The vulture will not even be on the bump map image because now I'm grouping the relevant layers for the color map and the ones for the bump map. You can see that the grouping of the color layers put them into group position where the last selected element was and thus in the background. After naming the group, I proceed with the bump layer. I'm missing the circle of stars badge in the bump map, so I copy the blue rectangle to the bump group. The color should be a light gray instead of blue, and after some final tweaking I'm ready for the export. I make sure that only the color group and the white rectangle is selected. The white rectangle not only serves as my background, it's also the delimiting shape which defines the export area. In the export dialog, Affinity Designer allows me to define the area that gets exported. With selection only, it will export only the selected objects. The image then will have a size in that all the objects will fit. But because I have only the white background selected, the preview looks empty even though it has the right size. But if I go for selection area, it will include all visible objects inside the selected objects area. Clever, isn't it? After setting up the export, I must specify the folder and file name. I'm not in my work in progress folder anymore, but in textures. I select an existing naming file, for it already has the naming scheme. The _C hints to a file containing the color map. And after that I do exactly the same for the bump map, but this time the postfix is _B. In DAZ Studio I apply the exported bump map to the face surfaces bump map parameter. But inspecting the array preview I realize that it looks somewhat odd. That is because the bump map is flipped. Remember, everything black goes in, everything white comes out? So I invert the bump map, this time not with Affinity Designer but with a free tool called Irfan View. Irfan View allows me to invert an image. Under Image, Negative, I decide for all channels. The result I save with the postfix _BI for bump map inverted. If I exchange the bump map file in DAZ Studio, the render looks more credible. Even though it looks pretty good, we should address another feature the iRay shader offers, because if you are like me, you might have asked yourself what that normal map just below the bump map slider is. A normal map is just another way to give the shader more height information than it could derive from the actual mesh. But while the bump map defines the height via grayscale pixel values, the normal map tells the shader in which direction the normal vectors shall point. It does so by shining a red, green and blue light from the respective X, Y and Z axis onto the mesh. The amount of reflected light will be stored in a 2D image. The shader can then extract that information from the map and fake normals that are not in the geometry information. Because this is not straightforward to achieve and in many cases we don't have access to the underlying geometry, there are tools for the creation of normal maps from photos. In many cases these tools allow to play around with parameters to optimize the object's look for the desired purpose. Also, a photo with a lighting that brings out the contrast of all the crevices can be very suitable for the normal map creation. I could use this tool since Affinity Photo doesn't offer normal map generation out of the box. But in the Affinity forums I found out that someone created an asset with a filter for that. I installed that following the instructions in the forums post. And then also following the not so straightforward process described in the forum, I created the map. They have a settings dialog for the lighting where I load the bump map. I choose the non-inverted map and play around with the settings. I set the rotation where I think the axis should be. In this screen capture it's quite off though, because at the time of my experimentation I did not know that the orientation is determined rather by the geometry than the actual lighting. Finally, I export this as a PNG image. And now, let's apply the normal map, shall we? I've already duplicated the license plate and on the upper copy I set the bump to 0. We see the embossing disappears. I apply the previously created normal map to the shader's normal map property. Again, you can't see this because on my second screen I only captured the application while the file dialog is a new window. But now you see the differences between the bump map and the normal map. It doesn't look as consistent because the lighting axes were off at the creation of the map. Don't know what you think, but in my opinion the bump map looks better. Still not knowing what I'm actually doing, I created another normal map with a different lighting vector. I created a third copy of the plate and applied the new map only to find out that it didn't significantly improve the appearance. Please understand that this is by no means a proper and complete demonstration of how normal maps are to be done. It's just me playing around and realizing that for the way I'm gonna be using the license plate in my renders, the easier to set up bump map is more than sufficient. Now that I'm decided on the face surfaces shader, I want to share some thoughts on saving this as a material or shader asset. On the left side I brought in the content library pane, which is normally on my non-captured third screen. Here you see I have a folder selected containing the actual license plate asset as a set, but also 3 material assets. By double-clicking the set, I load the license plate into the scene. In the Surfaces pane, we see that the object has 3 surfaces: bottom, face and frame. With the Surface Selection tool active, I click a surface in the viewport and the Surfaces pane will follow my selection. On the far right, I see the shader settings applied to the selected surface. The license plate's face doesn't have the right shader, but I previously have a materials file saved which I can apply to the selected object. If I want to save a shader setting, I either can save the shader or the material. And I can do this either via the File Save As menu or the plus button in the Content Library pane. Saving via the File menu has the downside that it does not respect the location the Content Library pane refers to, so more navigation might be needed. That's why I like to use the plus button in the Content Library pane. A materials preset can contain multiple surfaces and the shaders. Once I chose a name, DAZ Studio opens a dialog allowing me to select the surfaces my preset will contain. In this case, I only select face. If I then load this preset, it will only affect the face surface. The other ones remain unchanged. Each surface contains checkboxes for all the underlying shader properties, so I could further limit the preset's contents. There is a clear distinction between the materials preset and a shader preset. In this case, I try to save a shader preset, but having all three surfaces selected. DAZ Studio does not know which surfaces shader to save, because apparently they were not able to add more hierarchy levels to the Save Filter dialog. That tells us before saving or loading a shader preset, the respective surface must be selected. But on the shader preset's plus side is that I can apply it to any surface, no matter what it's called. The only limitation is the shader type must be the same, so iRay or 3D Light, or some custom properties and so on. For my license plate asset, I prefer saving the different faces as material preset containing only one material for the face. And I know whatever type of license plate I save, it always must have a surface called face. So then remains one more thing, trying out the license plate on a car. The car I wanna try it out came with a US style license plate, which I get rid of first. DAZ Studio can delete geometry, but it's kind of an afterthought and there is no undo for this. Then I load my license plate asset into the scene and place it on the hatchback. Oh, its orientation is wrong, so turn it by 180 degrees. Here you can see why I made the bottom edge the object's origin rather than the center, because it's easier to fit to angled surfaces. Once it's placed nicely, I load the material, which also contains the specialized shader for the face. Not in every lighting the embossing will come out perfectly, but at nighttime… Well, I said at nighttime, it might look cool. And that's it. That's how I created a license plate for DAZ Studio with Blender and Affinity Designer. I hope you found some inspiration in those two videos, and I might see you in the next one. Who knows?